In the humid corridors of an Okinawa naval base, a quiet cafeteria worker was about to overhear something that would change everything. What started as routine breakfast service took a shocking turn when she came face to face with encrypted enemy transmissions that baffled the military's top intelligence analysts. Mei Tanaka wasn't your typical food service employee. For 8 years, she'd spent her life as a military cryptanalyst, specializing in Pacific theater operations, known for her ability to crack communication codes that defeated everyone else. When she encountered fragments of intercepted naval transmissions discussing ghost wave coordinates and synthetic language patterns, she had no idea she was walking into the most critical intelligence crisis of her career. May's decision to risk her carefully constructed invisibility and decode the enemy's plans would lead to the prevention of coordinated attacks on Allied communications infrastructure across the entire Pacific theater. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning humidity clung to the Okinawa naval base like a second skin, but inside the officers' dining facility, industrial air conditioning kept the temperature precisely at 72 degrees. Mei Tanaka moved through the breakfast service with the quiet efficiency that had defined her 3 years at the base, refilling coffee dispensers and arranging fresh fruit with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed. At 34, she possessed the kind of understated presence that made people forget she was there the moment they looked away. Dark hair pulled back in a regulation-compliant bun, navy polo shirt and khakis that hung loose enough to conceal her compact frame, and eyes that seemed to focus on nothing while actually cataloging everything. "Morning, May," called out Alex Ramirez as he grabbed his usual coffee and 2 donuts. Unlike most of the personnel who passed through the dining hall, Alex had been calling her by her first name since his second week on base, treating her like an actual person rather than part of the furniture. "Sleep okay? You look tired." "Good morning, Private Ramirez," she replied with the soft smile she'd perfected over the years, her accent marking her as distinctly Japanese, despite her perfect English. "Just thinking about the weather. Storm season coming." Alex nodded absently, but May caught the way his eyes lingered on her face with genuine concern. Most of the officers and enlisted personnel who frequented the dining hall saw her as part of the background infrastructure, pleasant, reliable, invisible. They had no idea that her seemingly casual positioning always provided clear sightlines to all entrances, or that her ears were attuned to conversations happening 3 tables away, automatically filtering and categorizing information with the precision of someone trained to find patterns in chaos. The morning routine continued around her like clockwork. Lieutenant Commander Sun-Ho Kim arrived at exactly 0730 hours, ordered his usual green tea instead of coffee, and immediately immersed himself in classified reports on his tablet. Commander Luis Moreno followed 10 minutes later, grabbing black coffee and a piece of wheat toast while conducting a hushed phone conversation in rapid Spanish that he probably assumed no one else could understand. Dr. Hanai Saito, the visiting cultural liaison from the Defense Language Institute, entered precisely at 8 a.m., carrying herself with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. What captured May's attention wasn't their presence, it was the tension radiating from their movements. The way Kim's usually steady hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he scrolled through his reports, the tight line of Moreno's jaw as he ended his phone call with what sounded like frustrated resignation. "The intercept came in at 0400, Kim said to Moreno in a voice pitched just low enough to discourage eavesdropping. 17 minutes of encrypted transmission, origin point approximately 200 nautical miles northeast of our position." May continued arranging silverware, her movements unchanged, but every nerve in her body had suddenly come alive. Kim's Korean was flawless, but she caught the slight shift in his inflection that suggested stress. Moreno's response was in English, clipped and professional. "Language analysis. That's the problem. It's not matching any of our standard decryption protocols. The syntax suggests East Asian origin, but the structure— Kim paused, glancing around the dining hall. His eyes passed over Mei without stopping. It's like nothing we've seen before. Dr. Hanai Saito approached their table with her coffee and a notebook, her academic confidence filling the space around her. Gentlemen, I've had a chance to review the preliminary analysis. While the transmission is certainly complex, I believe we're looking at a modernized dialect variation, possibly Mandarin with deliberately obscured tonal markers. Mei's hand stilled for a fraction of a second as she reached for a coffee filter. Something in the described pattern sparked recognition, not full understanding, but the nagging sensation of familiar territory glimpsed through fog. She forced herself to continue her routine, but her mind was already working, piecing together fragments from conversations she wasn't supposed to be comprehending. The cultural context suggests formal communication, likely military in origin, but the metaphorical framework is throwing off our automated systems. I'll need at least 48 hours to develop a comprehensive interpretation matrix. 48 hours. Mei bit back the urge to correct the obvious error in Dr. Saito's approach. The linguistic pattern they were describing wasn't metaphorical, it was deliberately archaic, designed to sound like classical poetry while containing modern tactical information. The technique had been used by insurgent naval groups operating out of remote Pacific islands, groups that most Western intelligence agencies assumed had been disbanded decades ago.
Ma'am? Alex's voice cut through her concentration. You okay? You've been cleaning that same spoon for like 5 minutes. Mei blinked, realizing she'd been standing motionless, polishing a piece of silverware, while her mind processed intelligence that was supposed to be far above her clearance level. Sorry, distracted. Storm season makes me nervous. Alex glanced toward the windows, where brilliant sunshine streamed across the dining hall. Looks pretty clear to me, but I guess you'd know better than a kid from San Diego. He lowered his voice, moving closer to the serving counter. Hey, can I ask you something? You seem to know a lot about weather patterns and stuff. Did you study meteorology or something? The question was innocent enough, but Mei felt the familiar clench of anxiety that came whenever anyone showed curiosity about her background. Just experience living here. You learn to read the signs. But Alex wasn't buying the deflection entirely. She could see it in his eyes, the same analytical curiosity that had made him one of the youngest intelligence analysts on base. It's just, sometimes when you're listening to conversations, you get this look, like you're solving puzzles in your head. Before Mei could respond, Commander Moreno's voice rose slightly, carrying across the dining hall with unmistakable frustration. 48 hours might be 48 hours too long. Washington wants preliminary assessment by 1400 today, and Admiral Doyle is breathing down my neck for anything actionable. I understand the pressure, Commander, Dr. Saito replied, her academic composure beginning to show cracks. But rushing the analysis could lead to misinterpretation. These dialectical variations require careful consideration of historical context, and historical context won't help us if there are hostile vessels moving toward our position, Kim interrupted. The transmission pattern suggests coordination between multiple units. If this is operational planning— He didn't finish the sentence, but Mei heard the unspoken conclusion as clearly as if he'd shouted it. Coordination between multiple naval units using obscure dialectical variations that were designed to fool Western decryption systems suggested either a very sophisticated state actor or the resurrection of tactics that were supposed to be dead and buried. Mei moved to clear tables near the officers, her presence so routine that they continued their conversation without pause. As she collected dishes, she caught fragments of technical details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Multiple transmission origins, coordinated timing, linguistic patterns that suggested both sophistication and deliberate misdirection. The pieces formed a picture that made her stomach tighten with recognition. Under her breath, so quietly that she could barely hear it, Mei whispered a single phrase in Manchu, an ancient dialect that had been used by naval insurgents in the 1940s to coordinate attacks against larger military forces. The phrase she whispered was a traditional greeting, but it also served as a linguistic key, the kind of cultural password that could unlock layers of meaning in seemingly innocent communications. "Did you say something?" Alex asked, appearing beside her with a tray of dirty dishes. "Just mumbling to myself," Mei replied, but she could see in his expression that he'd heard something, even if he hadn't understood it. Old habit. As the morning progressed and the dining hall gradually emptied, Mei found herself returning again and again to the fragments of conversation she'd overheard. Multiple transmission origins, coordinated timing, linguistic patterns that suggested both sophistication and deliberate misdirection. The pieces formed a picture that made her stomach tighten with recognition. That night, alone in her small on-base apartment, Mei sat on her narrow bed and stared at the locked footlocker beneath her window. She hadn't opened it in 3 years, hadn't even thought about its contents for months at a time. But now, with fragments of an intercepted transmission echoing in her mind, she found herself remembering skills she'd tried to forget and knowledge she'd worked to bury. The storm season was coming indeed, but it might not be the kind of storm that showed up on weather reports. The footlocker's lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo far too loudly in the sparse quarters Mei called home. She hadn't heard that particular click in 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, not that she was counting. Inside, beneath a layer of civilian clothes she'd never worn, lay the carefully organized remnants of a life she'd tried to leave behind. The encrypted drive was exactly where she'd left it, wrapped in anti-static material and tucked inside a waterproof case. Her hands trembled slightly as she powered up her personal laptop, not connected to any network, a habit from her previous career, and inserted the drive. The security protocols required 3 different authentication methods, including a biometric scan and a passphrase she'd hoped never to use again. "Sakara dreams of winter storms," she whispered to the empty room, and the drive unlocked. Files cascaded across her screen, linguistic analysis matrices, dialectical pattern databases, cultural interpretation guides spanning dozens of Pacific Rim languages and their historical variants. This was the intellectual toolkit she'd spent 8 years developing as a military cryptanalyst, specializing in communications intelligence for operations across Southeast Asia and the broader Pacific theater. The fragments she'd overheard in the dining hall took on new significance as she cross-referenced them against her archived linguistic databases. Multiple transmission origins suggested coordinated fleet movement. The use of archaic dialectical patterns indicated either academic over-sophistication or deliberate operational security designed to confuse Western analysis methods. The embedded cultural metaphors that Dr. Saito had mentioned pointed towards something far more specific than simple military communication. Mei opened a new analysis file and began reconstructing the transmission details from memory, her fingers moving across the keyboard with muscle memory that 8 years of disuse hadn't quite erased. She worked methodically, building linguistic pattern maps and cultural context matrices, following analytical pathways that led deeper into territory she recognized with growing unease. The pattern wasn't random. It wasn't even particularly sophisticated by modern cryptographic standards, but it was effective precisely because it relied on cultural knowledge that existed in very few minds. Knowledge of historical Pacific naval insurgency tactics, of linguistic codes developed by resistance groups operating between Japanese-occupied territories during World War II, of cultural metaphors that had been passed down through generations of seafaring families who'd learned to hide their true intentions in plain sight.
She paused, her cursor hovering over a particular symbol pattern that had triggered recognition. The structure wasn't just familiar, it was specific. A greeting format used by a particular group of naval resistors who'd operated out of the Kurils, a group that American intelligence had assumed was completely disbanded by 1947. A soft knock at her door made her freeze. After a moment, she heard Alex's voice through the thin walls. "Mei?"
Sorry to bother you, but I saw your light on. Everything okay? She quickly minimized her analysis windows and opened the door, finding Alex standing in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and the concerned expression. I couldn't sleep either, he said, offering her one of the cups. Kept thinking about what Commander Moreno was saying this morning. Multiple coordinated transmissions? That's not routine communications, is it? Mei accepted the coffee, grateful for the warmth against her suddenly cold hands. I wouldn't know. I just serve food. But Alex had that analytical look again, the same expression she'd caught on his face in the dining hall. You know more languages than just Japanese and English, don't you? I've heard you mumbling to yourself in what sounds like, I don't know, maybe Korean? Something else? The question was casual, but Mei felt the weight of it. Alex was an intelligence analyst, trained to notice patterns and inconsistencies. Her cover story had been carefully constructed, but it was designed to fool security clearance investigators, not curious colleagues who saw her every day. I picked up some phrases during my childhood. My grandfather traveled throughout the Pacific for his work. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her grandfather had indeed traveled throughout the Pacific as a cryptographer for the Japanese Navy during World War II, before defecting to Allied forces and spending the rest of his life teaching his granddaughter about the linguistic patterns used by resistance networks across the region. Alex nodded, but she could see him filing away the information, adding it to whatever profile he was unconsciously building. The thing is, he said, settling into her single chair while she remained standing by the window, is I've been thinking about what Dr. Saito said, about metaphorical frameworks in cultural context, and I keep remembering this expression you had when they were talking, like you were solving something. Mei took a careful sip of coffee, buying time while her mind raced through possible responses. The truth would expose not just her past, but potentially compromise ongoing operations she wasn't even supposed to know about. But deflection was becoming increasingly difficult as Alex's natural curiosity focused on her inconsistencies. I was thinking about storm patterns, she said finally. When you live in a place long enough, you learn to read the signs. Weather, people, patterns of behavior. Sometimes things that seem unrelated are actually connected. Alex leaned forward, his coffee cup falling forgotten from his hands. What kind of connections? The question hung in the air between them, and Mei realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue deflecting, maintaining the careful distance she'd cultivated for 3 years, or she could trust the young analyst who'd treated her with more genuine respect than anyone else on base. Behind her, the laptop screen cast a faint glow through the curtained window. Somewhere in those files was the key to understanding the intercepted transmissions that had the entire intelligence staff so concerned. Knowledge that could prevent whatever operation was being coordinated by hostile forces. Knowledge that she was uniquely qualified to provide. Alex, she said quietly, what would you do if you knew something important, but revealing it would change everything about your life? He studied her face in the dim light, and she saw the moment when curiosity transformed into understanding. I'd probably be terrified, he said honestly, but I think I'd do it anyway, especially if other people were at risk. Mei turned back to her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. With a few clicks, she reopened her analysis windows, revealing the linguistic pattern matrices and cultural interpretation guides that represented 8 years of specialized intelligence training. Ghost wave coordinates, she said softly, reading from her preliminary analysis. That's what they're transmitting. Movement orders, disguised as classical poetry, using dialectal variations that most modern analysts wouldn't recognize. The pattern suggests coordinated submarine deployment, probably multiple vessels moving toward strategic positions in the South China Sea. Alex stared at the screen, his coffee cup falling forgotten from his hands. "Mei, how do you know this?" She looked at him steadily, knowing that her answer would shatter the careful invisibility she'd maintained for 3 years. "Because I used to be the person they'd call when no one else could crack the code." The morning briefing room buzzed with the kind of controlled tension that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Commander Moreno stood at the head of the polished conference table, with his usually immaculate uniform showing signs of a sleepless night, while Lieutenant Commander Kim projected yesterday's intercept analysis on the main screen. Dr. Hanai Saito occupied her usual position near the front, surrounded by stacks of reference materials and linguistic charts that had so far yielded more questions than answers. Mei entered through the service entrance, wheeling a toffee cart that provided her legitimate access to spaces where her presence would otherwise be questioned. She'd been doing this for 3 years, moving invisibly through briefings and strategy sessions, absorbing information while serving beverages, ignored by people who made life-and-death decisions based on incomplete intelligence. Today felt different. Today she knew exactly how incomplete their intelligence was.
Dr. Saito cleared her throat, consulting her notes with the confidence of someone accustomed to academic deference. The transmission structure suggests a 3-layer encryption method. Surface level appears to be standard Mandarin with tonal modifications. Beneath that, we have metaphorical constructions that reference classical Chinese poetry. The deepest layer contains what I believe to be coordinate references disguised as geographical descriptions. Mei carefully arranged coffee cups on the serving table, positioning herself where she could observe both the linguistic analysis on screen and the faces of the intelligence team. Dr. Saito's interpretation was sophisticated and completely wrong. Timeline estimate. Rear Admiral Karen Doyle's voice cut through the briefing with characteristic directness. She arrived from Pearl Harbor the previous evening, her presence indicating that Washington was taking the intercepted transmissions very seriously indeed. "Another 18 to 24 hours for complete decryption," Dr. Saito replied confidently. "The metaphorical framework requires careful consideration of historical context, and I want to ensure accuracy rather than—" "Ma'am," Kim interrupted respectfully, "we've intercepted a second transmission. Same origin signatures, similar encryption patterns, but the content appears more urgent. If this is operational coordination—" He let the implication hang in the air. Mei continued her routine service, but her mind was racing through the fragments of conversation. A second transmission with more urgent content could only mean one thing. Whatever operation was being coordinated was moving from planning to execution phase. "Let me hear it," Admiral Doyle commanded. Kim activated the audio system, and the briefing room filled with 17 minutes of what sounded like classical poetry being recited in a dialect that no automated system could identify. To most ears in the room, it was simply foreign language text that would require expert interpretation. To Mei, listening from behind the coffee service, it was a detailed movement order for submarine vessels approaching critical infrastructure targets. She set down a coffee cup with unnecessary force, the ceramic clicking against the saucer loud enough to draw momentary attention. In that instant of silence, she whispered a single phrase under her breath. A traditional acknowledgement in the dialect being used, the kind of automatic response that would be meaningless to anyone who didn't understand the cultural context. Private Alex Ramirez, who'd been taking notes near the back of the room, looked up sharply. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Mei resumed her careful invisibility.
The temporal markers suggest urgency, but the cultural references are even more obscure than the first intercept. This will require additional research into regional dialectal variations. Additional research. Mei bit back frustration as she watched the team pursue analytical pathways that would consume precious hours while hostile forces moved into position. The temporal markers weren't suggesting urgency. They were countdown sequences, traditional timing coordinates that referenced tidal patterns and lunar phases to synchronize naval movements. As the briefing continued, Mei made her decision. Moving to a terminal in the back corner of the room, ostensibly to input service inventory data, she accessed the anonymous suggestion system that allowed base personnel to submit intelligence tips without revealing their identity. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, entering a brief note that would appear in Commander Marino's queue within an hour. Recommend analysis of transmission as Kyril maritime dialect circa 1940s. Pattern suggest submarine coordination using tidal timing references. Linguistic structure based on Ainu naval poetry traditions, not Chinese metaphorical framework. She submitted the tip and returned to her service duties, knowing that the suggestion would either be dismissed as random speculation or trigger questions she wasn't prepared to answer directly. The briefing concluded with assignments that would keep the team busy for another full day. Dr. Saito expanding her metaphorical analysis, Kim cross-referencing transmission origins with known hostile vessel positions, various specialists brought in to provide additional linguistic support. Meanwhile, if Mei's analysis was correct, submarine forces were already moving toward positions where they could cripple communications infrastructure and trigger chaos throughout the Pacific Theater. As the room emptied, Alex lingered near the service area, pretending to refill his coffee while the last of the senior officers filed out. Kyril maritime dialect, that's pretty specific knowledge for random speculation, he asked quietly. Mei continued cleaning coffee cups, not looking up. Sometimes people know things. The thing is, Alex continued, his voice carefully casual, I ran a background check on you last night. Official channels, nothing invasive. But your file is pretty thin for someone who's been on base for 3 years. Almost like someone edited out all the interesting parts. Her hands stilled for a moment before resuming their rhythm. Maybe there weren't any interesting parts. Or maybe, Alex said, moving closer to the service counter, or maybe someone with your level of linguistic knowledge didn't end up serving coffee by accident. Before Mei could respond, Commander Marino's voice echoed from the hallway. Ramirez, in my office now. We need to discuss this anonymous tip about Kyril dialects.
Alex's eyes widened as he looked between Mei and the direction of Moreno's voice. The anonymous suggestion system logged IP addresses and terminal access codes. It would take the intelligence team approximately 15 minutes to trace the tip back to her service terminal. Mei, Alex said urgently, whatever's in your past, whatever reason you have for hiding it, you might not have that luxury much longer. As he hurried toward Moreno's office, Mei stood alone in the empty briefing room, surrounded by the remnants of coffee service and the echo of intercepted transmissions that painted a picture of imminent threat. Through the windows, she could see the Pacific stretching endlessly toward horizons where hostile forces were moving into position, guided by coordinates that only she fully understood. In approximately 14 minutes, her carefully constructed invisibility would be over. The question was what she intended to do with the time she had left. Alex found Mei in the small storage room behind the dining facility, methodically checking inventory on canned goods with the same focused attention she brought to everything else. The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows across shelves lined with institutional-sized containers of coffee and condiments. She didn't look up when he entered, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful control that suggested someone prepared for confrontation. "They traced the tip," he said without preamble, closing the door behind him. "Commander Moreno spent 20 minutes grilling me about Kuril dialects and anonymous intelligence submissions. Wanted to know if I'd heard anyone discussing historical Pacific naval linguistics." May's hand paused on a container of sugar packets. What did he tell him? That I'd never heard of Kuril dialects before this morning, which is technically true. But he's not stupid, Mei. Neither is Lieutenant Commander Kim. They're going to figure out that tip came from someone with very specific knowledge. She finally looked at him, and he was struck by the exhaustion in her eyes. Not physical tiredness, but the weariness of someone who'd been carrying secrets for too long. Maybe they'll assume it was lucky guessing. Except you weren't guessing, were you? Alex pulled out his tablet, opening a secured note-taking application. Last night, when you showed me those linguistic analysis files, you didn't just recognize the transmission patterns, you understood them completely. Mei returned to her inventory check, but her movements had become mechanical, distracted. Understanding and proving understanding are different things. Not when people's lives are at stake. Alex positioned himself where she couldn't avoid seeing his tablet screen. "I've been thinking about what you said. Ghost wave coordinates, submarine deployment patterns, countdown sequences. If you're right, we're not looking at routine intelligence gathering. This is operational planning for something big." The weight of unspoken knowledge seemed to settle heavier on May's shoulders. She set down her clipboard and leaned against the metal shelving, finally giving him her full attention. The second transmission wasn't just more urgent, it contained movement confirmation from multiple vessel commands, at least 4 separate submarine units, possibly more. They're using a coordination system that references traditional tidal timing, lunar phases, seasonal current patterns, natural navigation markers that wouldn't appear in any modern naval database. Alex's fingers moved across his tablet, recording every word. "How can you be certain?" "Because I've seen this system before." May's voice carried undertones of old pain, memories she'd clearly worked to suppress. "During joint operations in the South China Sea, we encountered remnants of maritime resistance networks that had survived since World War II. They'd maintained traditional navigation and communication methods specifically because modern intelligence agencies had forgotten they existed." "We." Alex caught the pronoun, filed it away with all the other pieces that didn't fit May's official personnel file. She seemed to realize her slip, but instead of deflecting, she made a decision that Alex could see forming in real time. Lieutenant Colonel Mei Tanaka, former military cryptanalyst, Pacific Theater Operations, specialized in maritime communications intelligence and traditional naval linguistics. The title hung in the air between them like a bridge Alex wasn't sure he was prepared to cross. A lieutenant colonel didn't end up serving coffee on a naval base without some kind of dramatic intervening circumstances. "Former," he said carefully. "I resigned under complicated circumstances. A mission went wrong, people died, and I was deemed unsuitable for continued service. The official record shows administrative discharge for unspecified reasons. The unofficial record is classified above your clearance level." Alex looked at her, really looked at her, and began seeing details he'd missed before. The way she carried herself, unconsciously military, despite 3 years in civilian support roles, the automatic situational awareness, the linguistic knowledge that went far beyond casual cultural exposure, the careful distance she maintained from everyone as if connection itself was a security risk.
"The third transmission will arrive within 18 hours, Mei continued, her voice taking on the clinical precision of a professional intelligence briefing. "Based on the timing patterns and coordination references in the first 2 intercepts, it will contain final targeting data and execution timelines. When it does, Dr. Saito's cultural analysis approach will be completely inadequate. They'll waste critical hours pursuing academic interpretations while hostile forces move into attack positions. Attack positions for what? Mei pulled out her own device, not the standard issue tablet that base personnel carried, but a hardened military-grade unit that Alex recognized as equipment typically reserved for officers with high-level security clearances. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, calling up detailed analysis frameworks that would have taken most analysts hours to construct. Undersea communications infrastructure, she said, displaying a tactical map that showed cable routes connecting Pacific military installations. The transmission patterns indicate coordinated strikes against fiber optic hubs that carry classified communications between allied forces. Disable those hubs simultaneously, and you create a communications blackout that would last days, maybe weeks. Alex stared at the analysis, understanding dawning with sick certainty. Long enough to execute a larger operation while allied forces can't coordinate response. Exactly. Mei closed the tactical display but continued scrolling through linguistic analysis matrices that represented years of specialized training. The poetry they're using isn't metaphorical, it's mnemonic. Traditional verses that encode precise coordinates and timing sequences. Each stanza corresponds to a specific target. Each cultural reference provides navigational data that Western intelligence systems would interpret as decorative language. "You need to brief command," Alex said immediately. "Commander Marino, Admiral Doyle, the whole intelligence staff. If you're right about the timing." "If I brief command, I expose myself completely. Every aspect of my past becomes open for investigation. The reasons I left military service, the classified operations I was involved in, the people who died because I made the wrong call." Mei's careful composure finally showed cracks, years of suppressed emotion bleeding through. "I came here to disappear, to become invisible and stay that way." Alex copied her analysis files to his secure storage, knowing that the decision he was about to make would change both their lives irrevocably. What if you didn't have to expose yourself? What if the intelligence reached command through unofficial channels? "You mean submitted under your name?" Mei understood immediately, and Alex saw her weighing the implications. "Your career would be over if they discovered the real source." "Maybe. Or maybe preventing a coordinated attack on Allied communications infrastructure would be worth the risk." Alex closed his tablet, meeting her eyes directly. "The question is whether you trust me enough to let me try." Commander Marino's office felt smaller than usual, with Admiral Doyle occupying the guest chair, her presence transforming the space from a routine administrative environment to an interrogation chamber. Mei sat across from them, flanked by Lieutenant Commander Kim and a security representative she didn't recognize, a man whose credentials identified him as Agent Holbrook from Naval Criminal Investigation Service. The anonymous intelligence report that Alex had submitted under his own authorization lay open on Marino's desk, its pages covered with analytical conclusions that could only have come from someone with years of specialized training in Pacific maritime linguistics. The kind of training that didn't appear anywhere in Private Ramirez's official education record. This analysis suggests detailed knowledge of historical resistance communication systems, knowledge that extends far beyond anything in our current database of hostile capabilities, Marino began, his voice carrying the controlled anger of a commanding officer who discovered his intelligence had been compromised. Alex maintained his position at attention near the door, but Mei could see the tension in his stance. They'd agreed on a simple story. He'd developed his conclusions through intensive research and cross-referencing of historical intelligence files. It was plausible enough to provide cover, assuming no one looked too closely at the timeline. "Understand," continued Agent Holbrook, consulting his own tablet, "the linguistic analysis demonstrates familiarity with classified operational patterns from joint Pacific Theater missions conducted between 2019 and 2021. Information that Private Ramirez should have no access to." Admiral Doyle had remained silent throughout the initial questioning, but now she leaned forward with the focused attention of someone accustomed to cutting through procedural complexity to reach operational truth. "Private Ramirez," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority. "I've reviewed your educational background and training records, impressive work in signals intelligence, strong analytical capabilities, but nothing that explains the depth of cultural knowledge demonstrated in this report. Where did you acquire expertise in historical Pacific naval linguistics?" The question hung in the air, and Mei watched Alex struggle with maintaining their agreed-upon cover story while under direct scrutiny from investigators trained to detect deception. She could see the moment when he realized their plan was unsustainable.
"Ma'am," Alex said carefully, "I received assistance in developing the analysis. Collaboration from someone with relevant background knowledge." "What kind of collaboration?" Moreno demanded immediately. "And with whom?" Mei stood up, knowing that protecting Alex required ending the charade. "Commander, the analysis came from me. Private Ramirez was attempting to provide cover for unauthorized intelligence activities." The silence that followed felt weighted with implications. Agent Holbrook immediately began typing on his tablet, undoubtedly running database searches on her identity. Admiral Doyle's expression didn't change, but Mei caught the slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested intense evaluation. "Miss Tanaka," Moreno said slowly, "you're assigned to food service operations. Your security clearance provides access to common areas and basic facility information. Nothing that would explain knowledge of classified maritime communication systems." "That is correct, sir. My current assignment does not provide that access." "Then how do you explain this analysis?" Agent Holbrook looked up from his tablet, and Mei saw recognition dawning in his expression. "Lieutenant Colonel Mei Tanaka, 7th Intelligence Battalion, Pacific Fleet, discharged 2021 under classified circumstances." The identification hit the room like a concussion wave. Lieutenant Commander Kim straightened in his chair, suddenly seeing her with completely different eyes. Moreno's anger transformed into confusion and calculation. Admiral Doyle, however, showed no surprise at all. "Admiral," Agent Holbrook continued, "Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka's discharge was connected to Operation Jade Current, a joint intelligence mission that resulted in civilian casualties and operational compromise. Her security clearance was revoked pending investigation, and she was removed from active duty." "The investigation that was closed without resolution," Admiral Doyle said quietly, her words carrying implications that made Agent Holbrook pause in his recitation. "The investigation that classified all findings above top secret and sealed the records indefinitely." Mei felt the familiar weight of old injustice, the knowledge that her career had ended not because of professional failure, but because someone with higher clearance needed a scapegoat for decisions that went wrong at levels far above her authority. "Ma'am."
"Dr. Sato," Mei replied evenly, settling into the chair that Lieutenant Commander Kim had indicated. "I've reviewed your analysis of the first two transmissions. Your approach to the metaphorical framework is sophisticated, but I believe you're interpreting cultural references as artistic decoration when they're actually functional intelligence." The room's background conversation quieted as other analysts tuned in to what was clearly going to be a professional confrontation between two very different approaches to intelligence interpretation. "I have a doctorate in Pacific sociolinguistics," Dr. Sato replied, her composure showing the first signs of strain. "My interpretation is based on comprehensive academic research into regional dialectal variations and historical poetry traditions. And my interpretation is based on operational experience with the same resistance networks that developed these communication systems." Mei pulled up the linguistic analysis sheet prepared, displaying it on the main screen where everyone could see. The poetry isn't metaphorical, it's mnemonic. Each verse encodes specific tactical information using cultural references that serve as cryptographic keys. Lieutenant Commander Kim leaned forward, studying Mei's analysis with the focused attention of someone trained to evaluate intelligence from multiple sources. "Can you demonstrate the difference?"
Mei highlighted the second stanza of the first transmission, breaking down the linguistic components in real time. Dr. Sato interpreted this line as a reference to seasonal fishing patterns, but the specific terminology, nets cast in silver current, is actually a coordinate reference using traditional navigation markers. Silver current refers to a specific submarine trench northeast of our position. She overlaid bathymetric data onto the tactical display, showing how the poetic description corresponded to precise geographical features that would be invisible to satellite surveillance, but known to any submariner trained in traditional Pacific navigation methods. The verse structure provides timing coordinates, Mei continued, highlighting additional sections. Each line corresponds to tidal phases and lunar positioning. What appears to be artistic rhythm is actually a countdown sequence. Dr. Sato studied the overlay, her academic confidence beginning to show cracks. The cultural context you're describing, it's not documented in any standard linguistic database. Because it was developed by resistance networks specifically to avoid documentation. The knowledge was passed down through operational training, not academic study. Mei pulled up additional analysis, showing connection patterns between seemingly unrelated phrases. This isn't theoretical linguistics, Dr. Sato. It's applied cryptography using cultural knowledge as encryption keys. Commander Marino had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he moved to the display showing Mei's tactical interpretation. If your analysis is correct, these aren't random submarine movements. This is coordinated positioning for simultaneous strikes. Yes, sir, and the timing sequence indicates execution within hours, not days. Mei highlighted the final stanza of the second transmission. This section contains what Dr. Sato interpreted as traditional farewell poetry, but it's actually an acknowledgement protocol, confirmation that all units have received targeting data and are moving into final positions. The implications settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. If Mei was right, they weren't looking at an intelligence-gathering operation or routine naval exercises. They were watching the final preparations for a coordinated attack on Allied communications infrastructure. There's something else, Mei continued, calling up frequency analysis data that she'd reconstructed from memory. The origins aren't random. They correspond to approach routes towards 3 specific undersea cable hubs that carry encrypted communications between Pacific Fleet commands. Lieutenant Commander Kim immediately began cross-referencing her coordinates with current vessel tracking data. If hostile submarines are positioning near those cable hubs, they could sever communications between Allied forces across the entire Pacific theater, Mei finished. Create a blackout window long enough to execute a larger operational objective while preventing coordinated response. Dr. Sato had been studying Mei's linguistic breakdown with increasing intensity, her academic skepticism gradually giving way to professional recognition. The syntactic structures you've identified, they're consistent with historical documentation of resistance communication methods. I was interpreting them through modern linguistic frameworks, but you're reading them as operational codes. Because that's what they are, Mei said, not unkindly. Academic analysis looks for meaning within established cultural contexts. Operational analysis looks for meaning that's deliberately hidden from those contexts. A new alarm sounded from the communications monitoring station, and all heads turned toward the analyst manning the intercept equipment. Third transmission incoming. Same origin signatures, but the encryption pattern is different, more complex. Mei was already moving toward the monitoring station before he finished speaking. Can you isolate the frequency bands and run spectrographic analysis? Already on it, but this one's heavily distorted, almost like they're using multiple transmission methods simultaneously. The third intercept began playing through the room's speakers, and Mei felt recognition hit her like a physical blow. The dialect wasn't just archaic, it was deliberately obscure, using linguistic patterns that existed in the knowledge of perhaps 50 people worldwide. That's not standard Kuril maritime dialect, she said, her voice carrying undertones of growing urgency. It's Manchu naval folklore blended with Korean resistance poetry, a combination that shouldn't exist unless—
She trailed off, implications forming faster than she could verbalize them. Unless what? Commander Moreno demanded.
unless someone with access to classified linguistic databases is deliberately creating hybrid communication systems to defeat Western decryption methods. Mei looked around the room, meeting the eyes of analysts who were beginning to understand that they were facing something far more sophisticated than they'd initially assumed. We're not dealing with historical resistance networks. We're dealing with someone who studied those networks and improved on their methods. The third transmission defied every analytical framework they'd developed over the previous 48 hours. Where the first two intercepts had followed recognizable patterns, complex but ultimately comprehensible to someone with Mei's specialized knowledge, this final communication seemed to shift between linguistic systems with deliberate unpredictability. Manchu naval folklore blended seamlessly into Korean resistance poetry, which transformed without warning into what sounded like ancient Japanese court language before cycling back through dialectical variations that shouldn't have existed in the same historical period. Mei stood before the main analysis screen, her fingers tracing linguistic patterns that appeared and disappeared like mirages. Around her, the intelligence center had fallen into the kind of focused silence that preceded either breakthrough or complete analytical collapse. Dr. Saito worked at a secondary station, her academic resources finally proving useful as she provided historical context for the cultural references that Mei was identifying in real time. The opening stanza uses Manchu naval folklore, specifically terminology that was used by maritime units operating out of the Kuril Islands during the 1940s. But the syntax structure follows Korean resistance poetry patterns that weren't developed until later. Lieutenant Commander Kim leaned over her shoulder, following her analysis with the focused attention of someone trained to find patterns in chaos. Synthetic language development? Someone combining historical systems to create something new? More than that, Mei pulled up comparative databases showing how specific phrases from the transmission matched references in multiple historical sources. This isn't random combination. Someone has studied classified intelligence files on Pacific resistance networks and deliberately synthesized the most effective elements. Commander Moreno moved to the tactical display, where satellite feeds showed ocean areas corresponding to Mei's previous coordinate interpretations. Effective for what purpose? Mei's analytical software beeped softly, indicating pattern recognition matches in the deeper layers of the transmission. What she saw made her stomach tighten with recognition. Diversion, she said quietly, the word carrying implications that seemed to suck energy from the room. The submarine positioning we identified from the first two transmissions. It's not the primary objective. It's misdirection. Explain. Admiral Doyle's voice cut through the room. She'd been observing from the back, letting the analytical team work without interference, but now moved forward with the focused intensity of someone sensing critical information. Mei highlighted a section of the transmission that had initially appeared to be decorative poetry. But the specific geographic references, when cross-referenced with modern infrastructure maps, she overlaid the cultural geography onto contemporary tactical displays. They're not describing fishing areas. They're describing undersea cable hub locations that aren't on any public charts. The implications hit the room like a physical force. Lieutenant Commander Kim immediately began calling up classified infrastructure maps, confirming what Mei's analysis suggested. Classified cable routes, he said, his voice tight with understanding. Communications infrastructure that doesn't appear in standard intelligence databases. Someone with very high clearance provided geographic references for cable hubs that most of our own analysts don't know exist. Dr. Saito looked up from her historical research, her face pale with recognition. The linguistic synthesis isn't just sophisticated, it's specifically designed to defeat Western analytical methods while providing precise targeting data for infrastructure that requires classified access to identify. Mei continued working through the transmission, her analytical software highlighting patterns that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The submarine positioning we identified from the first two transmissions, it's designed to draw attention and response assets towards obvious targets. While Allied forces are responding to threats against known infrastructure, the real attack will occur against classified communications hubs that we won't think to defend. Timeline, Admiral Doyle demanded.
The astronomical data in the final stanza suggests execution during the next lunar phase transition. That gives us, she checked astronomical data, calculating traditional navigation timing, 4 hours and 23 minutes. The room erupted into controlled activity as intelligence analysts began coordinating with tactical response teams. But Mei continued staring at the final section of the transmission, a passage that had resisted all her analytical attempts. "There's something else," she said, loud enough to cut through the operational chaos. "The last verse doesn't follow any of the pattern structures we've identified. It's not Manchu, Korean, or Japanese. The syntax is completely unfamiliar." She isolated the audio and played it through the room's speakers. The sounds were clearly human language, but they followed no recognizable grammatical patterns. Dr. Saito listened with the focused attention of someone trained to identify linguistic families and historical connections.
"That's not historical," Dr. Saito said slowly. "That's not any language I've encountered in Pacific regional studies." Mei felt recognition tickling the edge of her consciousness, a pattern that seemed familiar but refused to resolve into understanding. She played the section again, this time running it through spectrographic analysis to identify tonal patterns and rhythmic structures. "It's synthetic," she realized suddenly. Not just synthetic language combination, entirely artificial linguistic construction. Someone created a completely new language system specifically for this transmission. "Created by whom?" Commander Marino asked, but Mei was already working through implications that made her previous analysis seem simpler by comparison. "Someone with access to classified intelligence files, advanced linguistic training, and detailed knowledge of Allied communications infrastructure." She turned to face Admiral Doyle directly. "Someone inside Allied intelligence who's been developing synthetic communication systems specifically to coordinate attacks against our own infrastructure." The silence that followed felt weighted with the recognition that they weren't just facing an external threat. They were dealing with a sophisticated insider operation that had been years in development, using knowledge that could only have come from within their own intelligence systems. Admiral Doyle's expression didn't change, but Mei caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was processing information that went far beyond the current operational situation. "Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka," she said formally, "I'm placing you in temporary command of linguistic analysis for this operation. Dr. Saito will provide historical support, but tactical interpretation is your responsibility." She paused, meeting Mei's eyes directly. "And I want continuous updates on any additional patterns you identify in that synthetic language. If someone inside our intelligence apparatus is coordinating with hostile forces, I want to know who, when, and how." Mei nodded, accepting responsibility she'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. But as she turned back to the analysis screen, working to decode communication systems that represented threats to Allied forces across the Pacific, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her discharge: the satisfaction of using her skills to protect people who depended on intelligence she was uniquely qualified to provide. 4 hours and 23 minutes to prevent coordinated attacks on infrastructure that most people didn't know existed. And somewhere in the synthetic language patterns, clues to identify an insider threat that had been operating within Allied intelligence for years. For the first time in 3 years, Mei Tanaka was no longer invisible. The operations theater held 37 people representing every branch of Pacific Fleet intelligence and tactical operations. Mei stood at the central podium, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. 3 hours ago, she had been serving coffee to these same officers. Now she was about to brief them on coordinated threats against Allied communications infrastructure based on her interpretation of synthetic language patterns that no one else could decode. Admiral Doyle sat in the front row, her presence lending authority to proceedings that otherwise might have devolved into bureaucratic chaos. Commander Marino occupied the seat beside her, his initial skepticism having transformed into something approaching professional respect. Dr. Saito had positioned herself near the back, her laptop open to reference materials that supported Mei's linguistic analysis. "Ladies and gentlemen,"
Mei began, her voice carrying the calm authority she developed during 8 years of military briefings. We are facing a coordinated attack on Allied communications infrastructure designed to create a strategic blackout across the Pacific theater. The objective is not simply to disrupt our communications, but to use the resulting chaos as cover for a larger territorial assertion in the South China Sea. She activated the main display, showing tactical maps that overlaid her linguistic analysis with real-time intelligence data. The enemy's plan operates on 3 levels. First, obvious submarine positioning near known cable hubs, designed to draw our defensive response toward visible threats. Second, simultaneous attacks on classified communications infrastructure that most of our forces don't know exists. Third, exploitation of the resulting communication disruption to advance territorial claims while Allied forces cannot coordinate effective response. Lieutenant Kim leaned forward, studying the tactical display with focused intensity. Timeline for execution. Based on the title references in the final transmission, initial strikes will commence in approximately 3 hours and 47 minutes. I highlighted specific geographic coordinates on the display. However, the synthetic language patterns in the third intercept suggest this is the culmination of a longer-term operation. Someone has been positioning assets and developing capabilities for months, possibly years. A voice from the middle of the theater spoke up, Captain Rodriguez from Submarine Operations. What kind of capabilities are we talking about? Mei pulled up her analysis of the synthetic language components, displaying linguistic structures that demonstrated sophisticated intelligence coordination. The artificial language system used in the final transmission required access to classified historical intelligence files, advanced cryptographic training, and detailed knowledge of current Allied communications architecture. This suggests coordination between external hostile forces and someone within our own intelligence apparatus. The implications settled over the room with uncomfortable weight. An insider threat operating at high levels of classification represented a fundamental compromise of Allied intelligence operations. Recommendations, Admiral Doyle asked, her voice cutting through the murmur of concerned conversation. Mei had spent the previous hour developing tactical responses based on her understanding of the enemy's operational methodology. 3-pronged counter-operation. First, deploy stealth reconnaissance assets to confirm submarine positioning at both obvious and classified infrastructure sites. Second, implement preemptive cyber operations to disrupt coordination between hostile vessels before they can execute simultaneous strikes. Third, conduct immediate security review of personnel with access to the historical intelligence databases used to develop the synthetic communication system. Captain Rodriguez consulted his tactical tablet. Stealth recon deployment will take 90 minutes minimum. If your timeline estimate is accurate, that puts us very close to the enemy's execution window.
Which is why the cyber operations component is critical, Mei continued. The synthetic language patterns suggest the enemy is relying on real-time coordination between multiple submarine units. Disrupt their communications at the moment they're attempting to execute simultaneous strikes, and their operational advantage disappears. Commander Moreno stood up, addressing the room with the authority of someone who'd made the transition from skeptic to advocate. I'm authorizing immediate implementation of Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka's recommendations. Submarine operations will coordinate reconnaissance deployment. Cyber Warfare Division will prepare disruption protocols. Intelligence Security will begin immediate review of personnel access logs. Furthermore, Admiral Doyle added, her voice carrying implications that extended far beyond the current crisis. Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka will coordinate real-time intelligence analysis throughout the operation. Her understanding of the enemy's communication systems makes her uniquely qualified to identify tactical changes as they develop. Alex Ramirez, who'd been taking notes near the back of the theater, raised his hand. Ma'am, request permission to assist Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka with operational coordination. I've been working with her analysis frameworks and can provide technical support. Admiral Doyle nodded approvingly. Granted, you'll both report directly to me throughout the operation.
As the briefing concluded and personnel dispersed to their respective operational assignments, Mei felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders. But this time, it came without the isolation and institutional skepticism that had characterized her previous military service. Dr. Saito approached the podium, extending her hand with genuine professional respect. "Lieutenant Colonel, I owe you an apology. Your operational expertise identified threats that my academic approach completely missed." She paused, then continued with the honesty of someone reassessing fundamental assumptions. "I'd like to continue collaborating if you're willing. Your practical knowledge combined with historical research might prevent future intelligence failures." Mei accepted the handshake, seeing in Dr. Saito's eyes the recognition that effective intelligence required both theoretical knowledge and operational experience. "I'd welcome the collaboration, Dr. Saito. Academic research provides context that operational analysis often misses." As the operations theater emptied, Mei remained at the podium, looking out at the space where she'd just briefed senior officers on threats she'd identified through skills she'd thought she'd never use again. 3 hours and 47 minutes to prevent coordinated attacks that could reshape the strategic balance in the Pacific theater. For the first time in 3 years, she was exactly where she belonged. The operations center hummed with the controlled tension of coordinated military action unfolding across thousands of square miles of Pacific Ocean. Banks of monitors displayed real-time feeds from stealth reconnaissance drones, cyber warfare status updates, and tactical maps showing the positions of both Allied response assets and suspected hostile submarine contacts. Mei stood at the central coordination station, her fingers moving across multiple displays as she tracked communications intercepts and tactical developments simultaneously. 6 hours had passed since her briefing. 6 hours of carefully orchestrated operations based entirely on her interpretation of synthetic language patterns that could have been completely wrong. The weight of that responsibility pressed against her chest with every breath, but she maintained the professional composure that had carried her through 8 years of military intelligence operations. "Reconnaissance confirms submarine contacts at coordinates Alpha through Delta," Lieutenant Commander Kim reported from the submarine operations station. 4 vessels, positioned exactly where Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka's analysis predicted, but they're maintaining holding patterns, not moving toward attack positions. "Because they're waiting for coordination signals," Mei replied, highlighting communication intercept data on her primary display. "The synthetic language patterns suggest execution requires simultaneous confirmation from all units. Disrupt that coordination, and the entire operation collapses." Admiral Doyle had remained in the operations center throughout the night, monitoring developments with the focused intensity of someone who understood that strategic decisions made in the next few hours could affect Allied Pacific operations for years to come. Status on cyber operations. Commander Moreno consulted his tactical display, where cyber warfare specialists were tracking electronic infiltration of hostile communication systems. Penetration achieved on 3 of 4 submarine communication networks. Final target proving more resistant, but our analysts believe breakthrough is imminent. Mei watched communications intercept patterns shift in real time, showing the electronic signatures of hostile forces attempting to coordinate through increasingly disrupted communication channels. The synthetic language they'd used to defeat Allied decryption was proving equally vulnerable to direct cyber attack on their transmission systems. Alex appeared beside her coordination station, carrying coffee and the kind of exhausted expression that came from 14 hours of continuous intelligence analysis. "Any change in the intercept patterns?" "They're adapting," Mei said, pointing to frequency variations that showed hostile forces shifting to backup communication methods. "But adaptation takes time, and time works in our favor. Every minute they spend re-establishing coordination is another minute for our reconnaissance assets to confirm target locations and positioning." An alarm sounded from the cyber warfare station, and all attention focused on the specialist monitoring electronic infiltration operations.
Breakthrough achieved on final submarine communication network. Full spectrum disruption now active across all identified hostile vessels. Mei felt something shift in the intercept patterns displayed on her screen, a sudden absence where coordinated communication had been flowing continuously for hours. That's it. They've lost coordination capability. Confirmed submarine contact dispersal, Lieutenant Commander Kim called out, watching tactical displays that showed contact signatures beginning to separate from attack positions. Hostile vessels are breaking off approach vectors and moving toward open ocean. The operations center fell into the kind of stunned silence that followed successful completion of operations that could have gone catastrophically wrong. Mei stared at her displays, watching electronic signatures that confirmed her analysis had been accurate and their tactical response had been effective.
Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka, Admiral Doyle's voice cut through the silence with formal authority. Your linguistic analysis and tactical recommendations have prevented coordinated attacks on Allied communications infrastructure. I'm immediately recommending you for commendation and requesting permanent restoration of your security clearance. Furthermore, she continued, moving to stand beside Mei's coordination station, I've received communication from Pacific Fleet Command. Your previous discharge has been reviewed and expunged from your military record. You are hereby offered reinstatement to active duty with your former rank, along with assignment to a new Pacific Strategic Intelligence Group being formed specifically to address emerging threats like the one we faced tonight. Mei felt emotion rising in her throat. Not just relief at operational success, but something deeper. Recognition, vindication, the restoration of professional identity she'd thought was lost forever. Ma'am, she said, her voice steady despite the intensity of feeling, I accept reinstatement and assignment to Pacific Strategic Intelligence. Alex grinned beside her, exhaustion replaced by genuine joy at seeing someone he'd believed in finally receive the recognition she deserved. So I guess this means no more cafeteria duty? No more cafeteria duty, Mei confirmed, but she found herself thinking about the 3 years she'd spent moving invisibly through the dining facility, observing and listening and developing understanding of how intelligence operations functioned when viewed from outside the official hierarchy. That perspective, she realized, had been as valuable as her formal training. She'd learned to see institutional blindness from the inside, to understand how expertise could be overlooked when it came from unexpected sources. It was knowledge she intended to use, not just to advance her own career, but to ensure that other overlooked voices found recognition before crises forced their emergence. 6 weeks later, Lieutenant Colonel Mei Tanaka walked through the Naval Base dining facility wearing the dress blue uniform that marked her return to active duty. The morning routine continued around her. Coffee dispensers being refilled, fresh fruit arranged with institutional precision, officers and enlisted personnel moving through breakfast service with the comfortable efficiency of established patterns. But now she was part of the official hierarchy, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked. The new cafeteria worker, a young Filipino woman named Rosa, moved through the service area with the same quiet efficiency Mei remembered from her own time in the position. Mei paused beside the coffee station, watching Rosa arrange silverware with careful attention to detail, and saw something familiar in her focused concentration. Rosa, Mei said gently, how long have you been working here? 2 weeks, ma'am, Rosa replied, her voice carrying the careful deference of someone still learning institutional protocols. Still getting used to everything. It takes time. Mei remembered her own early weeks of learning to navigate military social structures while maintaining appropriate invisibility. If you have questions, or if you notice anything unusual, please don't hesitate to speak up. Sometimes the people in support positions see things that others miss. Rosa looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting a uniformed officer to acknowledge her potential contribution to base operations. Thank you, ma'am. I'll remember that. As Mei continued through the dining facility, she reflected on the transformation that had brought her from serving coffee to briefing senior command on strategic intelligence operations. But more than personal vindication, she'd gained understanding of how institutional structures could overlook valuable expertise when it came from unexpected sources. Later that morning, she stood before the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Conference, addressing 200 officers and analysts who'd gathered to hear about emerging threats and intelligence methodologies. Her presentation focused not just on the technical aspects of linguistic analysis, but on the critical importance of recognizing expertise wherever it existed within military organizations. The synthetic language attack we prevented 6 weeks ago succeeded initially because our analytical frameworks relied on traditional academic approaches. The breakthrough came when we combined theoretical knowledge with operational experience, academic research with practical intelligence. But more importantly, it came when we started listening to voices that institutional hierarchy had trained us to ignore. She clicked to her next slide, showing organizational charts that highlighted support personnel and their potential contributions to intelligence operations. Every person on every base has knowledge that could prove critical to operational success. The question is whether our institutional structures provide mechanisms for that knowledge to reach decision-makers before crises force recognition. In the front row, Alex Ramirez, now wearing the insignia of a newly promoted sergeant, took notes with the focused attention of someone who'd seen firsthand how overlooked expertise could emerge at critical moments. Beside him, Dr. Saito nodded approvingly, her academic perspective having evolved to incorporate operational realities. Commander Moreno, who'd introduced Mei's presentation, stood up as she concluded her remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, Lieutenant Colonel Tanaka has been selected to lead the Pacific Strategic Intelligence Group, focusing specifically on emerging threats and non-traditional intelligence sources. Her work will include developing protocols for identifying and incorporating expertise from throughout our organizational structure.
After the conference, Mei walked back through the base toward her new office in the Strategic Intelligence Building. But she took a detour through the dining facility, where Rosa was preparing for the lunch service. "Rosa," she said, stopping beside the service counter, "I'm establishing a new program for personnel who might have insights relevant to intelligence operations. Would you be interested in participating? It would involve reviewing communications intercepts and providing cultural context that might help with analysis." Rosa's eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like relief. "Ma'am, I speak 4 languages, and my family has fishing boats throughout the Philippines. I've been listening to conversations here, and sometimes I hear things that sound unusual." "Exactly the kind of expertise we need," Mei confirmed. "Report to Sergeant Ramirez tomorrow morning. He'll brief you on the program and get you started with preliminary training." As she continued toward her office, Mei thought about the conversation she had had with Admiral Doyle the previous week. The Navy was implementing new personnel review procedures designed to identify hidden talents and expertise throughout the organization. It was a small step, but it represented recognition that effective intelligence required perspectives from every level of military hierarchy. Her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Pacific Fleet Command. A new intercept had been identified, this one using what appeared to be synthetic Tagalog blended with maritime terminology from the South China Sea. Traditional academic analysis was proving inadequate, and they were requesting her immediate assessment. Mei smiled, thinking about Rosa's family's fishing boats and her knowledge of Philippine maritime traditions. She had a feeling that tomorrow's intelligence briefing would include voices that 6 weeks ago would never have been heard in official channels. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was institutional. And that, she realized, was how real change happened. Not through dramatic revelations, but through daily decisions to listen, to recognize, and to value expertise wherever it emerged. In the dining facility behind her, Rosa continued her service preparations. No longer invisible, no longer overlooked. The voice in the silence had found recognition, and others would follow. The mission continued. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.